It began with a message, a small, innocuous buzz on Emily's phone that pulled her attention away mid-conversation. She glanced at the screen, smiled softly, then locked it before setting it down. It was a smile I hadn't seen in months, one that wasn't meant for me. I knew I shouldn't, but when she went to take her evening shower, I reached for her phone. It felt heavy in my hand, as if it already knew the weight of the truth it held. The message was still on the lock screen. Tom, you were amazing today. I can't stop thinking about you. The blood rushed to my ears as I stared at the words. A name I didn't recognize. A tone I couldn't mistake. When Emily stepped out of the bathroom, her hair damp and her skin glowing under the soft bathroom light, I studied her. This woman, my wife of 10 years, was suddenly a stranger. How long had I been missing this version of her? Or had she changed recently, piece by piece, slipping away while I was too busy to notice? That night, as she fell asleep next to me, I couldn't close my eyes. The rhythmic sound of her breathing felt deafening against the chaos in my mind. It wasn't just the message, it was everything leading up to it. The way she'd been pulling away from me lately. Her late nights at school, her newfound bursts of laughter that felt brighter when Clara was around. Clara, she had entered our lives only a few months ago, a whirlwind of charm and intensity. Emily met her through her art class and quickly became captivated by her. Clara was magnetic in a way I couldn't put my finger on, always pushing Emily to be bolder, more herself. It sounded innocent enough until I saw how much Emily had changed since Clara's arrival. She's so inspiring, Emily had said to me once. She says I should stop holding back in my art. In everything, the more I thought about it, the more Clara's influence felt insidious. She was always there, encouraging Emily, whispering things I couldn't hear. But was Clara the reason for this message? Or was she simply part of a larger fracture I hadn't seen forming? I couldn't ask Emily. Not yet. I needed answers first. The next day, I called in sick to work and drove to my brother David's house. I didn't tell him much, only that I needed to talk. He listened patiently as I spilled everything. The message, Emily's recent distance, Clara's presence. Before you do anything, David said, make sure you know the full story. People make mistakes, Jack, but jumping to conclusions will only make things worse. His words gave me pause. David was the steady one in our family, the person who always found the calm in chaos. If anyone could guide me through this, it was him. When I returned home that evening, I didn't confront Emily. Instead, I started paying attention, really paying attention. I watched her at school events, where Tom, the art teacher, was never far from her side. I noticed how her face lit up when they talked, the easy way they laughed together. And then there was Clara, always hovering. She would lean in to whisper something to Emily, and Emily would glance at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. By the time our 10th wedding anniversary arrived, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. The party we'd planned together felt hollow now. The fairy lights strung between the trees casting shadows on secrets we both refused to speak aloud. It wasn't until that night, surrounded by friends and neighbors, that everything came to a head. As I stood with a drink in my hand, watching Emily across the yard, I saw her talking to Tom. Their heads were close, their smiles too intimate. Clara stood nearby, sipping her wine and watching them with a faint smirk. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Emily, I called, my voice cutting through the chatter. The crowd quieted as heads turned toward me. She froze, her eyes wide as she realized everyone was watching. Jack? What's wrong? What's wrong? I said, stepping closer. Maybe you can tell me. Or should I ask Tom? The color drained from her face as the crowd murmured. Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Clara, who looked almost amused. This isn't the time or place, Emily hissed, her voice low and pleading. No, I said, my voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. The time and place was weeks ago, when I started noticing the lies. The secrecy. Do you want to explain? Or should I tell them what I found? The silence was unbearable. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night with Tom trailing behind her. I stood there, my chest tight, as the crowd dispersed awkwardly. Clara lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting mine with a look I couldn't quite place. Something between pity and triumph, before she, too, left. That was the night my perfect facade shattered. The morning after the anniversary party, I woke to an empty house. Emily was gone. No note, no message, just silence. I stood in the kitchen staring at the mug she always used for her morning tea, trying to make sense of everything. David's words echoed in my mind. Make sure you know the full story. But the full story felt like quicksand. Every step I took only pulled me deeper. I spent the next few days at David's place. He gave me space but stayed close enough to pull me out of my thoughts when I needed it. Have you tried talking to her? He asked one night over beers on his porch. She left with him, I said flatly. What's there to say? Maybe more than you think. His advice felt too rational for the chaos in my head. But he was right about one thing. I needed answers. So I started looking for them myself. I drove by the school that week, staying parked far enough away to avoid being noticed. I watched Emily and Tom as they interacted during drop-offs and pickups. There was no obvious intimacy, but their body language spoke volumes. The way he leaned toward her, the way she tilted her head when he spoke. And then there was Clara. She was always close, her presence like a shadow that lingered too long. She seemed to relish being in the middle of it all, laughing with Emily one moment, nodding conspiratorially with Tom the next. I turned to social media next, combing through posts and comments from the school's art department. Clara's name kept appearing. Photos of her and Emily at outings, captions filled with inside jokes. But buried beneath the curated moments was something darker. Old posts from other women, tagged with Clara's name, hinted at conflicts. Cryptic comments like, wish I'd seen the signs earlier, and she knows how to twist the knife when it suits her. The more I read, the clearer it became. Clara wasn't just Emily's friend. She was a catalyst for chaos. Fueled by equal parts anger and desperation, I decided to confront Clara directly. I found her at a coffee shop near the school, her ever-present charm on full display as she chatted with the barista. When she saw me, her smile faltered for just a second before she waved me over. Jack, she said, her tone bright but calculated. What a surprise. Not much of one, I'd think, I replied, sitting across from her. You knew I'd come eventually. Her eyes sparkled with feigned confusion. Whatever do you mean? I mean Emily, I said, leaning forward. And Tom. And you. You've been pulling strings this whole time, haven't you? She laughed, a light, dismissive sound. That's quite an accusation. I'm just a friend, Jack. Someone who wants Emily to be happy. Isn't that what you want too? Her words hit me like a slap. But behind her polished demeanor, I saw it, the satisfaction she couldn't quite hide. I know what you're doing, I said quietly. You're not helping her. You're tearing her down piece by piece. And when she's broken enough, you'll move on to the next person. For a moment, Clara's mask slipped. Her smile flattened, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Then, just as quickly, the charm was back. If Emily feels torn down, maybe that says more about her life than about me, she said smoothly. Maybe she's looking for something she hasn't been getting at home. I stood, my fists clenched at my sides. You've caused enough damage. Stay away from her. Clara tilted her head, the smirk returning. I don't think Emily's the one you need to worry about right now, Jack. Her words lingered like smoke as I left the coffee shop, my chest tight with anger. The confrontation with Clara left me more determined than ever. That weekend, I attended a school fundraiser, knowing both Emily and Tom would be there. I stayed on the outskirts watching. Emily looked radiant, her smile brighter than it had been in months. But it wasn't a carefree joy. It was forced, almost brittle. She laughed too loudly at Tom's jokes, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for approval. And there was Clara, always nearby, watching. I couldn't wait any longer. At the end of the night, as the crowd thinned, I approached Emily. Can we talk? I asked, my voice low but firm. Her smile faltered. She glanced at Tom, who hovered nearby, then back at me. Now's not a good time, Jack. It's never a good time, is it? I snapped, my voice rising. Heads turned, and Clara stepped closer, her expression unreadable. Tom placed a hand on Emily's arm, and something inside me snapped. You don't get to touch her, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through the room. "Jack, stop," Emily said, her voice tinged with panic. "No, Emily," I said, my anger spilling over. "You don't get to walk away from this." From me. Not without explaining how we got here. The silence was deafening. Emily looked at me, her eyes filled with something between anger and regret. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out, Tom following close behind. Clara watched them go, a faint smile playing on her lips. When she turned to me, her expression was one of mock sympathy. "Sometimes, Jack," she said softly, "things just fall apart." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The cracks in my world had finally given way, leaving nothing but rubble in their place. The days after Emily left were hollow, a blur of quiet mornings and sleepless nights. The house, once filled with her laughter and our shared routines, now echoed with absence. The news spread quickly in our tight-knit suburb. Whispers followed me everywhere, at the grocery store, the gas station, even during my morning runs. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, while others gave me pitying looks, their curiosity thinly veiled. "Jack, I'm so sorry," Mrs. Henderson from next door said one afternoon, lingering too long by her mailbox. "If you ever need to talk, dear, I'm here." I muttered a polite thanks and walked away, the weight of their judgment pressing against my back. Everyone had an opinion. Emily was either a restless woman searching for happiness or a heartless wife who'd betrayed a good man. Neither version felt true to me. David was the only one who seemed to understand. "You're not going to find peace through them," he said one evening as we sat in his backyard. "Forget what they think. Focus on what's next for you." "What's next?" I scoffed, staring into my beer. "How do you rebuild when the ground under you's gone?" "You start small," he said. "One step at a time." David's words stayed with me, though putting them into action felt impossible. The turning point came a week later when I stumbled across an online forum about infidelity and betrayal. At first, it felt voyeuristic reading the stories of strangers pouring their pain into paragraphs. But the more I read, the more I realized I wasn't alone. On a whim, I started my own blog. I called it Shadows of Suburbia, a name that felt fitting for the cracks hiding beneath our perfect lives. My first post was raw, a stream of consciousness about betrayal, loss, and the suffocating silence of an empty house. To my surprise, readers began responding almost immediately. Comments flooded in from people who'd been through similar pain, offering empathy and advice. "You're stronger than you think, Jack. The pain fades, I promise. Focus on yourself. She might come back, or she might not, but you'll find yourself again." The blog became my outlet. Writing felt like exhaling after holding my breath for weeks. And as I shared my story, I found solace in the stories of others. Meanwhile, Emily's absence stretched into weeks. I heard whispers that she and Tom were seen together in town, but I didn't chase those leads. If she was happy, I told myself, then so be it. But deep down, I couldn't shake the image of Clara hovering nearby, pulling strings only she could see. One evening, as I was writing a post about rebuilding trust after betrayal, I got an email. The subject line read, "I think you should know." Inside was a single sentence. "Clara isn't who you think she is." Attached were screenshots, messages between Clara and Tom. In them, Clara encouraged Tom's pursuit of Emily, goading him with phrases like, "She deserves someone who really sees her," and "Jack's too stuck in his routines to ever make her happy." The bile rose in my throat as I read. Clara hadn't just been a passive observer. She'd been actively orchestrating my marriage's collapse. But why? What did she stand to gain? I couldn't confront Clara directly. Not yet. I needed to understand her motives. I started reaching out to people from her past, piecing together a pattern that made my stomach churn. There were other Emilys, other marriages Clara had inserted herself into, always under the guise of friendship. Some ended in divorce. Others weathered the storm. But Clara always walked away untouched, leaving chaos in her wake. I documented everything, not for revenge, but for clarity, for closure. It was a rainy afternoon when I finally heard from Emily. She called, her voice shaky, asking if we could meet. We sat across from each other at a quiet cafe, the distance between us palpable. She looked tired, her once bright eyes dulled by something I couldn't name. "I made a mistake," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tom, he's not who I thought he was." I stayed silent, letting her speak. She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. "He was a distraction. I was unhappy, and he made me feel seen. But it wasn't real. None of it was." "And Clara?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. Emily's face darkened. "She's not my friend. She never was." She told me how Clara had subtly fueled her doubts about our marriage, planting seeds of discontent while pushing her toward Tom. She said you'd never understand me, that I needed someone more in tune with who I am, and you believed her? Tears welled in her eyes. I wanted to. I was so caught up in what I thought I was missing that I didn't see what I already had. Her words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over the fragile walls I'd built around my pain. "I'm sorry, Jack," she said, reaching for my hand. "I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to fix this, if you'll let me." I pulled my hand away, the weight of her words too heavy to process. "I need time," I said, standing abruptly. Emily nodded, tears streaming silently down her face as I walked away. That night, I wrote a post titled "The Line Between Forgiveness and Self-Respect." In it, I poured out my conflicting emotions, the anger, the grief, the faint spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. The comments were overwhelming. Some urged me to let her go, to focus on myself, and move forward. Others encouraged me to try counseling, to rebuild if love was still there. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected: clarity. A week passed before I saw Emily again. She called to ask if we could meet at the house, our house. I agreed, unsure of what I'd say, or even what I wanted. As I walked through the door, the smell of her perfume brought a rush of memories that tightened my chest. She sat at the kitchen table, a folder of papers in front of her. When I joined her, she pushed them toward me without a word. "What's this?" I asked, flipping through the pages. "Proof," she said, her voice steady but tinged with anger. "About Clara." The folder was filled with screenshots, emails, and handwritten notes, fragments of conversations that painted a chilling picture. Clara had been pulling the strings from the beginning. She had encouraged Emily to question our marriage, subtly undermined her confidence in me, and fanned the flames of her connection with Tom. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails Clara had sent to Tom, outlining her plan. "Clara, she'll fall for you if you push just enough. Jack's too blind to notice until it's too late. Once she's out, she'll realize what a mistake he was. Tom, are you sure about this? I don't want to ruin things for her. Clara, trust me. You'll be saving her." I set the papers down, my hands trembling. "How did you get these?" "Tom," Emily said bitterly. "He showed them to me after I broke things off. He said Clara's obsession with controlling people went too far, even for him." I leaned back, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "Why would she do this?" Emily hesitated, then said quietly she envied me. Or at least the version of me she thought I was: happy married, living the life she couldn't have. She told me once, after too much wine, that she'd never been able to hold on to anything good. I thought she was just being dramatic. Her words filled in the gaps of Clara's story. It wasn't just envy. It was her need to shatter what she couldn't have, to prove that no one deserved happiness if she couldn't find her own. Emily asked if we could talk about us, but I wasn't ready. Instead, I spent the next few days wrestling with everything I'd learned. My anger at Clara burned hotter than ever, but beneath it was a deep sadness for the damage she'd caused. Not just to my marriage, but to Emily, to Tom, to herself. I posted another entry on my blog, detailing Clara's manipulations without naming names. The response was overwhelming. Stories poured in from readers who'd encountered their own Claras, people who thrived on creating chaos. "You can't undo what she did," David said when I confided in him. "But you can decide what happens next. Do you want to move forward with Emily, or without her?" It was a question I wasn't ready to answer. Emily, however, was determined to fight for us. She suggested we try counseling. "Even if we can't fix this," she said, "I owe it to you to try. To give you answers and closure." I reluctantly agreed, not because I was certain we could save our marriage, but because I needed to understand how we had come so close to losing it. Our first session was brutal. The therapist, a woman named Karen, had us unpack everything, the good, the bad, and the moments we'd avoided talking about for years. I felt invisible, Emily admitted one session, her voice breaking. Not because you didn't love me, Jack, but because you didn't see how much I was struggling. Clara made me feel alive. I thought she was helping, but she was feeding my insecurities, and I thought everything was fine, I said, the bitterness clear in my tone. I thought we were happy. I didn't see any of it coming. Karen pushed us to dig deeper, to move past blame and into understanding. Slowly, we started piecing together the cracks in our foundation. The missed signs, the unspoken needs, the roles Clara and Tom had played in exploiting them. As weeks turned into months, counseling became a lifeline. Emily worked to rebuild my trust, and I worked to let go of the anger I'd been holding on to. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I wanted to walk away, to shut the door on everything we'd been through. But then there were moments, small but significant, when I saw glimpses of the Emily I'd fallen in love with. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Emily turned to me as we walked to the car. "Do you think we'll ever get back to the way we were?" she asked. "No," I said honestly, "but maybe we can be something better." Clara, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. The truths about her manipulation spread through the community, leaving her isolated and ostracized. Parents withdrew their children from her art classes, and former friends cut ties. Eventually, she moved away, leaving behind a legacy of broken relationships and unanswered questions. Emily and I weren't fixed, not completely, but we were trying, and that mattered. As our 10th wedding anniversary passed, we began planning something new, a renewal of vows, not as a way to erase the past, but as a promise to face the future together with honesty and intention. The vow renewal wasn't a grand affair. It was just us in the backyard where our anniversary party had crumbled months earlier. Fairy lights strung between the trees cast soft glows over a modest table set for two. This wasn't about fanfare. It was about rebuilding something fragile but real. Emily wore a simple white dress, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders the way she knew I liked. I stood in a navy suit, my palms clammy despite the cold evening air. As we faced each other, there was no officiant, no crowd, no witnesses, just us, surrounded by the echoes of what we had endured. "I don't have a perfect promise to give you," Emily began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I'm not perfect, and neither is our marriage. But I promise to keep trying, to be honest, and to let you in. No more secrets. No more walls." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "I can't promise that things will be easy," I said. "But I promise to be present, to listen, and to see you for who you are, not just who I think you should be." Our vows were messy, heartfelt, and imperfect, just like us. When we exchanged simple silver bands to replace the ones tarnished by the past, it felt like we were starting over. Not erasing what had happened, but writing the next chapter together. The months that followed weren't a smooth road. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. We had days where old wounds reopened, arguments flared, and doubts crept in. But we also had days filled with small victories, laughing over coffee, taking walks hand in hand, and finding joy in shared silences. Counseling continued to guide us, giving us tools to communicate, to fight fair, and to navigate the challenges ahead. We learned to appreciate the little things, a kind word, a moment of understanding, a quiet evening where everything just felt right. Clara's departure left a noticeable absence in our community, but her shadow lingered. Conversations about her manipulations surfaced at book clubs, PDA meetings, and casual neighborhood gatherings. She became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how envy and malice could ripple through even the most picturesque lives. But I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Not entirely. Her actions had torn my world apart, but they had also forced me and Emily to confront the cracks in our marriage. Without that destruction, we might never have rebuilt something stronger. By the time spring arrived, Emily and I had found a new rhythm. I continued writing my blog, sharing updates about our journey. Readers connected with our story, and many wrote back with their own tales of healing, heartbreak, and hope. Emily, inspired by the vulnerability I shared online, began channeling her emotions into her art. She painted again, not for the school or for Clara's approval, but for herself. One of her pieces, a sprawling mural of fractured glass reflecting a sunrise, became a centerpiece at the local gallery. "That's us," she told me when I saw it for the first time. "Broken, but still finding light." As our vow renewal symbolized, our marriage wasn't the same. It couldn't be, but it was real, honest, and that felt like enough. Months turned into a year. Life didn't return to what it was before. It moved forward, evolving into something new. Shadows of Suburbia grew from a small blog into a supportive community. What started as a personal outlet became a platform for others to share their stories. Some days, I spent hours responding to messages, offering advice where I could, and just listening when people needed it. I wasn't the man I had been before Clara, or Tom, or the messages that shattered my world. I was something better, someone stronger, more aware, more present. Emily and I still had our struggles, but we faced them together. The cracks in our marriage didn't disappear, but they became part of its beauty, like veins in marble, reminders of our resilience. As I closed my laptop one evening, after writing a post about forgiveness, Emily walked in holding 2 mugs of tea. She set one in front of me and kissed the top of my head. "Done for the night?" she asked. "For now," I said, turning to her. She smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. And in that moment, I knew we weren't just surviving. We were living.